Father in heaven, Lord, we thank you so much for blessing us, Lord, on this high Sabbath, Lord, to be here, to hear these wonderful truths taught to us, Lord, and to experience, Lord, what fellowship would be like for eternity. Lord, we thank you for binding us together at this time. And Lord, I'd like to ask a special blessing for Brother Theodore and Brother Parminder as they stand before your people to share with us, Lord, the beautiful words of life, Lord, that is enriching our souls and giving us a trust in you, Lord, a newfound love for you, Lord, that we have yet to experience. And we thank you for this. This has been the hope of our life, Lord. So we ask a special blessing upon them and your people as we receive these words. We thank you, Lord. And we ask these blessings in Jesus' name. Amen.
So we've been developing the line of the 144,000. And we've seen that it begins at the time of the end in 1989. It goes to 9/11, the Sunday law, the close of probation, and the second advent. And we've overlaid an agricultural model on top of that. The ploughing, the form rain, latter rain, and the harvest, or what we sometimes call the binding oath. The reason why we want to anchor ourselves at this line is because we have so much information about the events that are going on. When I say so much information, I mean particularly about these three waymarks. I've already explained not the detailed process of how it was done, but the logic behind how we have got 1989 and 9/11. 1989 is relatively straightforward because we can go to Daniel 11 verse 40 to develop that line. 9/11, it's a little bit harder, but I think most of us understand some of the logic. We've gone to Revelation 7, Revelation 9, we've gone to some Spirit Prophecy quotes, Testimonies to the Church, Volume 9. Now my sister doesn't like me using this one, Live Sketches for 11, because it's Review and Herald article. I can never remember the date. July 5th, 1906. I always had the year, but I always forget the month. So we should really go back to that article, because Live Sketches is just a clip of that whole article, so you don't get the context of what she's actually addressing. So that's the logic for creating those two waymarks, and I'm saying they were developed from an understanding that Ellen White's going to give us, that this would be 1844 and this would be 1798. I've already said, as soon as you start doing this, it causes some people some trouble because they can't see how you can relate 1844 with 9/11. They can't see the connection there. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I just want to for us to observe that 1844 has caused us problems, if I can just say it that way. Now we know that the Millerites, they understood October 44 to be a close of probation, and what we mean by that would be a judgment which was executive. They thought that the earth was going to be destroyed by fire. We know that they were wrong in that assertion, because this would be the Millerites, because the Spirit of Prophecy is going to say that this is not a close of probation, this is the beginning of the investigative judgment of the dead. And so this is the Spirit of Prophecy. So the question is, how do we address that problem? That the Millerites are teaching us one thing and Ellen White's teaching us another. And if you're a normal Adventist, you'd obviously ignore all of that because it's uninspired, and you'd go with Ellen White, and you'd blindside yourself in having the ability to go to the end of the world and making any kind of sensible application. So I've explained some of the logic. When I say the logic, I'm not saying this is the only way to do this. This is just an explanation that I'm offering about how we can approach, how we can understand what's happening here for us at the end of the world. I'm not saying it's the only way to do it. So I'm not saying this is how the movement did it, or how the movement should do it, or how you should. So if I were just to draw this structure like this, I think most of you are going to be familiar with this now. If I just did this picture work. And I'm not sure if I gave all three, but often I would. We can go to a model of rain to do this. We could go to the line of Christ and our line, and we can see how Ellen White's going to talk about the former and latter rain. We can do this with the second angel. And if we're going to do it with the second angel, we can then go to the Millerite line and our line. So I've given you two testimonies how to use that. And the reason why I think it's useful to do that, or helpful, is because all of this is, this structure is created through Spirit of Prophecy quotes. It's not something that we have to make application about. So we go into an original quote with its original intent and context. And if you can start a study that way, I think it's much more helpful. You're less prone to make mistakes when you do make an application. So I've discussed that. One thing that I want us to always remember is that any prophet, a modern day prophet, and what I mean by modern day, I mean who's living in the present. And so that could be Paul, Ellen White, Peter, it could be anyone, Jeremiah. These prophets are always going to go back to a reference point, and they're going to pick up that reference point, which is a historical phenomena, an event, and they're going to take that and they're going to make an application of that in their own history. So I think we're all familiar with prophets having the authority to do that. The difficulty comes is because we, as God's people, are unwilling to self-identify with this role of being a prophet. We seem fairly comfortable with a priest, and I've discussed that when we go to Isaiah 28, verse 7, that it says, whatever's gone wrong in Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets are to blame. And if you go through the following verses, essentially what's going to happen is God's going to raise up people to take over from the work of these drunk prophets and drunk priests. So this idea of priests and prophets is not new. It's just that, as I say, we're okay with the idea of priests because we kind of like talking about priests as being teachers, which was their primary role, but it wasn't their only role. They were to act as intercessors or mediators between two parties. They were to make judgment. As soon as you start talking about that kind of, you start having that kind of thinking, people get really nervous about the implications of what that means. So we have a really light touch about the symbol of what it means to be a priest. When it comes to a prophet, we've gone the other way. We take this hardline prophet. Are we suggesting that we have dreams and visions, that we don't make mistakes because whatever we're saying is a direct revelation from God? But we know there are two types of prophets. There are those who have special illumination, and those who, like William Miller, who is typified as Moses as an example, or as Elijah, that there are these two types of prophets. So when you come to priests, we've taken a very soft line, and when it comes to prophets, we've taken a very hard line. But there is a balance between them. So it's this concept of being a prophet where we can now make application of inspiration that allows us to take certain Spirit of Prophecy quotes and redefine them in a way that Ellen White did not do. Now, as soon as you start doing that, you can imagine how dangerous it is. So people object to us doing that. So if you're going to attempt to do that, and what I mean by that, it's not that let's start doing it now. We've been doing this for almost 3 decades. We've been doing it for a long time, but people have not noticed. People haven't realized that's what we're doing. So I'm saying when you can build a model that you can see most of it is built upon spirit prophecy quotes that you're not adjusting or making applications about, then when you do make the application, then you're on pretty safe ground because you're allowing these structures to guide you. People are going to object today that we allow the lines to take precedence over inspiration, and I strongly refute that. I don't think it's true, and this is an example to show that it's not true. I've given you 2 witnesses, and in each one of those histories you're going to end up having 6 waymarks. And remember I said if you take a verse, most verses, most ideas that a prophet gives are going to be talking about the end event, and the prophet who's in the present is going to try and understand what's happening in their own history, their own dispensation. So it's this one here that we're looking for, this waymark, more often than not. And you can build that based upon all of these events. And I've given you 2 testimonies, but in each one there are 2 testimonies. There's 1 and there's 2. There's 2 testimonies. So you can see that using this methodology you can ensure that you're probably not going to make mistakes. If you're careful, you won't make mistakes. Then what you can do once you develop this logic and you say, well, I think it's this, you take something such as a construction model or a marriage model or an agricultural model, and if you overlay it, then, and it fits, you have so many witnesses to know that what you're teaching is true. And really, if, upon the testimony of a thing is established, you know that everything's okay. So the point I wanted us to get from that is, I think without a recognition that we are taking inspiration and applying them in a way that the original author probably didn't intend, what we end up saying is, we'll read a Spirit of Prophecy quote or a Bible quote, and we end up manipulating them, taking them out of their context. And you know, it's okay to do that in a family setting like this, where no one's going to complain, because you give us poetic license, not prophetic license, poetic license. But when you go out into the harsh world, you're not going to get away with doing that. What is a wonder to me is how all of us actually got here. If you think about it, it's actually a miracle, because we claim to be students of prophecy, people who are really interested in studying their Bibles. We make a distinction between us and Laodicea, who don't really study much, and I would argue now most of us weren't studying properly when we came into this movement, because we got given quotes that were applications out of context, not all the time, but quite often they were taken out of context from the original setting, and we bought into that hook, line and sinker. We bought into that. If you've seen the last, I think 2 or 3 classes that we did, I gave an explanation for that. It was taken from, I think, 1SM 206, the passage that I've addressed a few times at camp now, but we went into that passage quite extensively. It's about the foundation of our faith. And just to say in a very simple fashion, what I did was to take 2 dates, 1844 and 1850, and I said this was the foundations of the Adventist Church. This is not negating, because there are plenty of Spirit Prophecy quotes that show that the history from 1798 to 1844 is also the foundation of our faith. I'm not negating that whatsoever. I'm also not negating the fact that if they were the foundations, then we can understand this to be the pillars. The 2 pillars would be the Sabbath and the sanctuary. It doesn't do away with any of that. But what I wanted to identify here is when this foundation was created compared to this one, and they're really the same foundation because these charts are the same chart. There's no new information on there except for the sanctuary and the Sabbath, the new light that they had. The fundamental difference between this history and this one is this history has some additional support, and it's by prophets. So there's inspiration that's going to be used here to construct this foundation in a way that it wasn't in this history. They didn't really have prophets taking a role. I know William Foy is in there, and Hayes and Foss are in that history, but they don't really participate in the establishment of that foundation. They make some comments. I don't think people even really fully understand what they're saying. Foy's document or his vision is actually, I think, put into print in 45. It's actually after this history anyway. So I'm not sure how much they're aware of what he's saying. We do know that the Millerites had access to his visions. I believe Ellen White actually went to one of his meetings, at least one, maybe more. So I'm saying this one is directed by inspiration. It begins here in 1844 with Edson, and then it goes to Ellen White. And if you watch those classes based upon the document that we were reading, there's an interesting phenomenon that's happening here. Ellen White says that she doesn't understand Scripture. She actually doesn't even understand what those verses mean. All she's doing is getting direct revelation from God, and when these people are struggling to know what's true, she just says, we've got three different views, and the correct view is this one. That's the correct interpretation of this verse. It doesn't say that in this passage, and I'm not sure that we can delve into that history to make that point, but that's what I'm suggesting. It's not like you have 5 opinions and they're all wrong and Ellen White has a 6th one that's correct. I think amongst them, someone there is having the right understanding, and Ellen White's going to pick the right one. I'm not saying I can prove that, but what we can prove is that Ellen White doesn't understand what inspiration really is, but she's going to go to inspiration, and she's going to tell you what that inspiration means, if we're okay with that logic. And what I then did was I made an application here that this is 9/11, remember 9/11 here, and I'm saying this is 2014. This is the history when the foundations are laid. I'm not addressing the discrepancy or the dichotomy between 2001 and 2004. I'm not trying to make that point here. But if the foundations are being laid over this history, here we're really not using methodology in the sense that people come together without any assistance and they just try to understand what the Bible's teaching. So I'm saying since 2014, when this idea of methodology is really beginning to have traction, and you know that's what's happening today, is that we're getting really focused upon what the Bible or Spirit Prophecy is saying and trying to go back and understand what we have done in this history. In this history here, we just said, take any quote you want and we'll tell you what it means. When I say we, I'm not trying to apply it to particular individuals or to the movement in general, but what I want to say is there's a distinction between these two histories. So if you were to go to Testimonies of the Church, Volume 9, you begin from page 11, the enemies of God are consolidating their powers and they're going to prepare for this great thing. We're now in the time of the end. If you see contextually what she's talking about, I'm making the suggestion, if you go ahead and read the passages where we were talking that it's a direct reference to 9/11, I don't think it was. I think it's a direct reference to the close of probation, the history there. But what we did in this history is someone stood up, taken this roll and says that passage means this thing. And what happened was everybody coalesced to that understanding, which is exactly the role that Ellen White plays in this history. You have all these variant views, nobody knows what direction they're going in. She stands up and she says, let me tell you what this verse means. And everybody says, we agree. And so you had an agreement, a coming together, or what we might call an assembling of a foundation that was directed by inspiration. Now I understand the implications of what I'm saying, I'm sure all of you do as well. But when you come to this point, the dynamics are different. I'm saying this, if I can say it this way, this prophetic gift is not there now, and I understand about the restoration of the gifts. I'm not trying to make that point, but here we're kind of left to our own devices. The role of Ellen White is going to be different, because here she says she doesn't understand. She says no understanding. And what did she say after that? She says my mind was opened, and now she can understand the Bible just as well as anyone else. So now she understands. If you haven't watched those studies, I think it's worthwhile you watching them. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think, that's just one passage. If you went somewhere else, you could find a reinforcement of this structure that's been developed here. That this explains what it means to be a prophet and the role of prophets in this movement and how they have operated, or how the movement operates as a prophet. Here, we're taking inspired quotes. We don't fully understand what they mean. We just say they mean this thing. And we say it with such authority that it creates a movement. I'm not arguing that the movement isn't created from back here, from 1989, but there's a difference between this history and this history. Once that foundation is laid, all we're doing now is essentially preparing ourselves to give the loud cry to the Nephilims and the Levites, but we're not relying upon this almost direct revelation of what a quote means. Because if someone says that quote means this, now we're saying, hold on, let's really start applying William Miller's rules seriously. Let's look at what the verse says. Let's look at the verses that follow and precede it, the chapter, the structure of the book. So once we start doing that, we're not using the same kind of thought process. And Ellen White says she understands Scripture as well as anyone else. So I want us to understand this concept about the foundations and the methodology. This has implications of what it means about what the foundations are, the construction of the temple, which I'm not going to go into, but it has ramifications on that, which I think will open up as time goes on. So hopefully that makes sense. It explains what I'm talking about when we speak of prophets. And I've discussed about this methodology of how we can anchor ourselves in spirit of prophecy without making applications, so that we can be safe to make applications. Before, when we did that, I don't know how to say it. Maybe we were... Anyway, we did it before, but I'm saying we're doing it differently now. So this idea here, that the Millerites are saying one thing and Spirit of Prophecy is saying another thing, we have to recognize that someone is making applications. I've already alluded to the fact that many of the mistakes or outright error that the Millerites were teaching actually begins to have ramifications in our history. If you've seen a presentation, I've said this so many times, and I used to say this just as an observation. Maybe some would see it as a criticism of the Millerites. But I just want to make this point. When we mark April the 19th, 1844, as the first day of the first month, we're actually incorrect in doing that. I don't know if we all realise, because it actually should be April the 18th. And the reason for that is because the Millerites, let me step one back. I should have done this probably a different way. Just to call this the first day of the first month, this is the spring. So without getting into the complexities of calendars, which I'm not intending to do, this would be January and this is December. This is how we do a year. And the Hebrews would do spring to spring. I think we're all familiar with that. Regardless of the month or how it works, or if we've got 13 months, it's spring to spring, and I'd say winter to winter. So I think all of us are familiar at that simple level that there's a difference. So you see the Millerites already thinking like the Hebrews or the Jews, and they have to then begin to take a Jewish mindset and bring it into the 19th century, which is a Roman era or a Gregorian era. So they're going to mix these calendars. So they're already thinking like this. So when they say the first day of the first month, they're thinking this way. Now, their thinking isn't just about the years, it's also how days work. So they already know that a day begins at sunset and ends at sunset. So we're all familiar with that, hopefully. If you're not, then I'm stating it as a fact, that the Millerites knew when a day starts. So it's April the 18th because it's at sunset, or in the evening of the 18th, and then it goes all the way through the day part of the 19th, and then it ends sunset on the 19th. And the reason they would say the 19th is because they would say this is the civil day, which means essentially not some kind of government day. I guess you could argue that, but they're saying this is what everybody understands as the day, so we'll just call it the 19th. So if we just run all the way here to October 22nd, which is the Day of Atonement, 10th day of the 7th month, all I want to pick up is when would that day end? It would end at sunset. Now I'm not sure exactly what time sunset is in October in the eastern seaboard of the United States, but I'm saying, say it's approximately 7 p.m. I think that's probably too late, it may be earlier, but I'll just say 7 p.m. in the evening. So it would have begun the day before on the 21st of October, that was the last day. So by the time they get to 7 p.m, the day's ended. So what should they have known, because Christ hasn't come back at 7 p.m? They would have known their message has collapsed, it's all failed. But what did they do? The record's clear. I think I've got the quote here. Let me read this to you, if I've kept it. This is from Danste's book, The Foundations of the Seventh-day Adventist Message and Mission. The coding for this is awkward. So if you've got the book, it's on page 99. So if you don't have the book, and if you're going to go to a digital source, it's easier just to go and find Danste's book instead of giving the coding. So this is page 99 of Gerhard Danste's book. I think we should all be familiar with that book. He says this, quoting from, let me see where he quotes from. This is a document by James White. It's a manuscript, so I'm just going to quote from here. He says, "Our expectations were raised high, and thus we looked for our coming Lord until the clock tolled 12 at midnight. The day had then passed, and our disappointment became a certainty." So I just stopped there. He explains it. It's quite interesting. So they wait till midnight. Now, I've made this point. How could they have repudiated their faith? By the time you get to 8 p.m, they already know it's a failed project. But what they do is they switch back to a Roman calendar. And I'm saying that's a rejection of their faith. They wait till midnight and they say, according to the Romans, according to this new calendar, we can wait till midnight, and when it's done, when he didn't come, then it's finished. But they should have finished the work here at 7 p.m. So I think Elder Jeff, in his board work, I think it was yesterday, based upon what Brother Theodore was speaking about, they mentioned October the 13th, which is the year 2018, and they went 391 days and a half, and it takes you to 2019, and then it goes to November the 9th. Is that right? Yep. And this was at noon. So if you just went noon to noon, it would be 391 days. It would take you to November the 9th. But because there's this half day in here, it goes to midnight. Now, people are asking, hold on, we thought that was close of probation, not midnight.
It starts at the midnight at the commencement. So 391 days only brings you to the 8th. You need that half day to get to the 9th.
Oh, okay, so that's midnight
Commencement.
on the 8th, which commences the day of November the 9th.
Yeah, because midnight always starts the day, not ends it.
So here's midnight to midnight, and we're marking this point, and this is the 9th of November. So people are asking, I thought that wasn't midnight, I thought it was close of probation. We're saying that it is close of probation. But I just want to identify that midnight is being marked here just at that simple level that the Millerites had marked to midnight for their close of probation, which it was not. It wasn't a close of probation, and it shouldn't have been midnight. And we're saying it is a close of probation, and it is midnight. And we're picking up all these characteristics from the Millerites. This is just another example of that. I don't know how many other little tricks and turns that the Millerites had embedded into their message that we haven't really gone back and double checked on, that we're still going to find they said something wrong, they said they weren't sure about, that we find that is correct. I mentioned October 13th here. It's already in your notes that they'd already marked October 13th. We've already discussed that. When you start going back to some other dates which nobody's really looked at, maybe we're going to find some things that have an application in their line which weren't correct that are going to be correct in ours. So I think I gave about 3 or 4 examples, yes, 3 examples, and there's another one here that everything that they did wrong ends up being right. And I'm arguing that's why Ellen White, and I know midnight or anything isn't on this chart, but when she says don't change the chart, I think that's not just literally don't change it, that's a code word of saying don't touch that foundation. Don't play around with it, because everything that was done there was, I'll say it this way, in God's order, whatever that may mean to you, because we wanted to have a permanent record of that so that at the end of the world, when we reference back to that information, it wasn't destroyed or eradicated. So I indicated yesterday we can take Matthew 13 and call this the world, and you have the wheat and tares, and they get cut off and these get burned into bundles, and I'm saying this is the 144,000 or the church, because this is the line of Adventism here at the end of the world. I want to read a statement that's connected to this. Now, when you start getting 2 different models and overlaying them, you have to be careful how you do that, because you can get tripped up if you're not careful. So it's never that wise an idea to mix 2 models together. But that's what I'm going to do. This is taken from The Great Controversy, page 608, paragraph 2. Great Controversy, 608, paragraph 2. This is chapter 38, the final warning. So chapter 38, the final warning, where would that go on this line? It would go here. This would be chapter 38. If you're going to go, this would be the Great Controversy. If you're going to go to early writings, this would be 277, which would be called the Loud Cry. It's the same history. You can overlay those 2 chapters. As the storm approaches, a large class, let me see if I want to go back. No, it's fine. As the storm approaches, a large class who have professed faith in the third angel's message but have not been sanctified through obedience to the truth abandon their position and join the ranks of the opposition. By uniting with the world and partaking of its spirit, they have come to view matters in nearly the same light, and when the test is brought, they are prepared to choose the easy, popular side. Men of talent and pleasing address, who once rejoiced in the truth, employ their powers to deceive and mislead souls. They become the most bitter enemies of their former brethren. When Sabbath keepers are brought before the courts to answer for their faith, these apostates are the most efficient agents of Satan to misrepresent and accuse them, and by false reports and insinuations to stir up the rulers against them. The reason why I don't like camp meetings is because I'm already guiding and directing you of where we're headed, and the problem is you don't have an opportunity, a proper opportunity to actually think about what I'm saying. And by the time it goes from my mouth into your ears and goes into your brain, you begin to make connections. It gets quite difficult to undo that information. So I've already directed you to say, this is chapter 38, it's in this history. Therefore, the implication is everything that we're reading, which I've just read here from 608, is in that history. But you have to read this really carefully, because there are other people who are going to say that this passage is a flashback. Now, I don't know if we all know what a flashback is. If you're here in the present and you have a flashback, a flash I'm going to call is a memory, which is back. And so you're going to go back into this state, this thing, and say, this, this, and this. And by the way, this happened in the past, and then you're going to go back and continue your story. So Ellen White does do flashbacks. I'm not saying that she doesn't. I'm suggesting this is not a flashback, this paragraph. But there are people, you know, people well versed in the spirit of prophecy who would suggest otherwise. Now, the difficulty comes, if I can just sort of explain some of the thought process that all of us should be thinking about, is how do we know where to place 608 paragraph 2? How do we know where we're going to do that? Are we going to just read it in its context and say, well, we think it's here, and then we're just going to state it as a fact? Or do we say, well, let's look at a structure, a line, to help guide us and direct us of when that's going to happen? You know, how would we approach this problem? This is where people begin to question our methodology about who's running the ship. Is it the quote or is it the line? I think it's a false argument. I'm saying this quote, so we're all clear, is talking about this history in the Sunday law. It's a Sunday law quote. And I'm going to explain why people come to different conclusions. As the storm approaches, so the storm, some people are going to say the storm is the Sunday law. That's what their argument, that's what this argument would be over. What is that storm that she's speaking about? I'm suggesting the storm is this. The plagues. Others would say no, the storm is the Sunday law persecution. And therefore you're in this history that precedes the Sunday law. Just want us to be clear about that, because maybe you haven't noticed it. As the storm approaches, a large class who have professed faith in the third angel's message but have not been sanctified through obedience to the truth abandon their position and join the ranks of the opposition. So I'm saying this is in this history here, and if you've got a group of people that are running through history here, and this group of people is the church, then you're going to have people begin to peel off. They're abandoning their position as the storm approaches. The abandonment begins here at the Sunday law when they begin to see what the implications of what they've been teaching is going to be as the storm comes. And then the group that goes all the way through, we mark as 144,000. So I'm saying, my understanding is that's what this is teaching. Other people have a different opinion. So the abandonment of the third angel happens in this history. And they join the ranks of the opposition. So these people who are leaving are going to join this group here, the tares, which I'll just call Babylon. By uniting with the world and partaking of its spirit, they have come to view matters in nearly the same light. So I'm suggesting that it's in this history here that they joined the world. And they joined the world not physically, but in their mind, in their thinking. They had become joined to the world. I'll read that again. By uniting with the world and partaking of its spirit, they had come to view matters in nearly the same light. And when the test is brought, they are prepared to choose the easy and popular side. And I'm saying that is the test. Men of talent and pleasing address, who once rejoiced in the truth, employ their powers to deceive and mislead souls. They become the most bitter enemies of their former brethren. When Sabbath keepers are brought before the courts to answer for their faith, these apostates are the most efficient agents of Satan to misrepresent and accuse them, and by false reports and insinuations to stir up the rulers against them. In this time of persecution, the faith of God's servants will be tried. To the next paragraph. They're faithfully given the warning, looking to God and to His word alone. God's Spirit moving upon their hearts has constrained them to speak. Stimulated with holy zeal and with a divine impulse strong upon them, they entered upon the performance of their duties without coldly calculating the consequences of speaking to the people the word which the Lord had given them. So I won't read any more. So let me summarize what I'm saying here. We've got the agricultural line here. The wheat and tares are going to be separated here in the harvest. But if you overlay what Ellen White has just spoken here, the church is running through this history. In the period of the former reign, when we were supposed to perfect Christian character, there's another group who have essentially imbibed the philosophy and thoughts of the world. But they're not really doing anything about it. When the test comes, and they begin to see the implications of where this is headed and the pressure begins to build, they begin to abandon their position and they join the ranks of the enemy. So this is how the 144,000 are going to come to exist in the way that we normally understand them, the people who are going to be translated here at the end of the world. Just want to read another passage to you that speaks to this. This is taken from early writings. It's the chapter called The Shaking. Before we read that, you don't have notes for this. This is taken from chapter 12 from Last Day Events. I gave you notes for chapter 13, if you recall. This is the chapter before, chapter 12. It's called The Shaking. I'm just going to give you the subject titles, and I'm just going to read some small snippets. Remember, it's a compilation, so they've drawn many Spirit Prophecy quotes, and all of this is talking about the shaking. I'm not suggesting they've got everything right about the placement of the shaking. I'll read the subtitles. The chaff separated from the wheat. Divisions will come in the church. Two parties will develop. The wheat and the tares grow together for the harvest. Next one. Superficial believers will renounce the faith. The work which the church has failed to do in the time of peace and prosperity, she will have to do in a terrible crisis under the most discouraging, forbidding circumstances. The warnings that worldly conformity has silenced or withheld must be given under the fiercest opposition from enemies of the faith. And at that time, the superficial conservative class, whose influence has steadily retarded the progress of the work, will renounce the faith. So she mentions here this worldliness, and then she says the warning that worldly conformity is silence or withheld must be given under the fiercest opposition in this history from enemies of the faith. And then she says, at that time, the superficial conservatives. Now, there's a note from the compilers who are going to tell you what a superficial conservative is, because sometimes we have a wrong idea. Ellen White is not here distinguishing the theological conservatives from their liberal counterparts. So this is not the conservatives and the liberals that are going to separate here. That's not the point that she's making. She's describing those who put worldly conformity first and God's cause second. So it's not an indication of how conservative or liberal you are in your eating or your dressing. It's talking about those who put God's word first, as opposed to those who put the world first. And that's where this is happening here. The distinction is being made in this history, and this is where it gets demonstrated who is who. The straight testimony produces a shaking. I'm not going to read the quote for that, I'm just giving you the title. It says, rejection of the testimonies results in apostasy. Defections among church leaders. Many will show that they are not one with Christ, that they are not dead to the world, that they may live with him. And frequent will be the apostasies of men who have occupied responsible positions. This is showing you, it's in this history here, that things in the church are being created, an environment to allow this to happen. Unsanctified ministers will be weeded out. The church may appear as about to fall. This is an interesting one. The shaking of God blows away multitudes like dry leaves. Chaff like a cloud will be borne away on the wind, even from places where we see only floors of rich wheat. So this is talking about this history, and this is where the church appears to fall, and it doesn't fall. The reason it appears to fall is because all these people are leaving, and it doesn't look like there's anyone left. Soon, God's people will be tested by fiery trials, and the great proportion of those who now appear to be genuine and true will prove to be base metal. And if you see the context of this, I'm suggesting this is the Sunday law. So I want to go back to this early writings passage. This is 271, paragraph 2. 271, paragraph 2. She speaks about a platform or a foundation, and God's people are standing on this platform. She talks about a dark cloud overshadowing them, some people looking up and some people not looking up. She sees about the work of God and how he assists and helps this group, that the cloud leaves them, and then this group are essentially enveloped in darkness. And that's the preamble of what we're about to read. No, that was a little bit fast. The numbers of this company had lessened. The company that she's referring to is this company that are on this platform. Some had been shaken out and left by the way. The careless and indifferent who did not join with those who prized victory and salvation enough to perseveringly plead and agonize for it did not obtain it. So I'm reading from paragraph 1. And they were left behind in darkness, and their places were immediately filled with others taking hold of the truth and coming into the ranks. Evil angels still pressed around them but could have no power over them. So this is the same history here. This is when people from God's church leave the church, they go into the ranks of the enemy, and immediately their places are taken up by those who join the church. I think she says things like, company after company leave, and tribe after tribe come and join and pick up the banner that had been left by those who had walked away. I hope we're all familiar with that model. So you know that I'm saying this is not an application, this is primary source material about the Sunday law history. We can then make application for other dispensations, maybe even for the priest, but this is the primary reference that she's speaking about. It's this history here. That's what I'm suggesting. Paragraph 2. I heard those clothed with the armour speak forth the truth with great power. it had effect. Many had been bound, some wives by their husbands, and some children by their parents. The honest who had been prevented from hearing the truth now eagerly laid hold upon it. All fear of their relatives was gone, and the truth alone was exalted to them. They had been hungry and thirsting for truth. It was dearer and more precious than life. I asked what had made this great change. An angel answered, it is the latter rain, the refreshing from the presence of the Lord, the loud cry of the third angel. So this is teaching us a few things. This is the loud cry when this happens. The loud cry or the latter rain is spilling over onto the recipients who were in Babylon, which I'm going to call Edom, Moab and Ammon in this history. So they're receiving some benefit of this latter rain. And the benefit is that now what's going to happen to them? They're going to be made free. We read that in Daniel 11 verse 41. We spoke about that. It says here they were held captive by relatives and friends or social ties. That bondage is taken away at the loud cry, which gives them the ability to go from this group and join the ranks of God's church. I just want to add this one point. You know, perhaps people in this movement, you've got some family ties, you've got some things going on in your family that you're not able to do what you want to do, some restrictions. And often we talk about, in this history, those family ties are going to be broken and you're going to be free to do what you want. If you take this primary reference, the people who are freed are the people that are receiving the loud cry, not the people who are giving the loud cry. All of us fit into that second category. We fit into the category of this group who are giving the cry. Therefore, you can't use the argument that you're in some kind of bondage in your family relationship with your spouse, and sometime or another you're going to be freed from that bondage in this history here, so you're free to give the third angel's message. You might make an application for that. It may give you some kind of comfort to do that, but if you're going to take that idea from a Spirit of Prophecy quote, I just want us to see that it's only the people here, in this context, Edom, Moab and Ammon, verse 41, that are going to be freed from those social constraints. And we've taught this from the very beginning, because it says in verse 41, many shall be overthrown. The many that are overthrown is this arrows here. But some shall escape. Edom, Moab and Ammon, they're the people who are in these social restraints. It's not us, because we're all free. So whatever your personal lives are, if you're thinking that you've got some social constraints with friends, church relationships, that you're hoping at some time you're going to be freed from them, that you can actually participate in this movement correctly, I'm suggesting that you're approaching the problem in an incorrect fashion. That work of freedom should have happened a long time ago, because if it's happening here, you've gone down the wrong track, because this is where it should have been sorted out. This worldliness, this attachment to social relationships should have been dealt with in this history and if you're going to make this, if I quickly make an application, if this was 2014, it should have been done here. It's a bit late to do that if you're in the movement now. I do recognise that at least half, if not more, of the people in this room came into the movement in this history from 2014 onward. So if you're saying, well, I had some social restrictions and I've broken away from that and here I am, it's because you're typifying this group here. Typifying isn't a good word to use in a reform line like this, but you're exemplified or exampled. I'm just going to use the word typified, it's the easiest one without explaining it. That you're represented by this group here, that you've come out of this bondage. So I'm hoping that I've overlaid those two lines and it's reasonably clear of how you even get the 144,000. One thing that I want us to see when we do this is that this idea that Adventism has seeing its last day here at the close of probation has some truth to it. There is a close of probation here, but it may not be what you think. That's a point that shows you what's happening here. I'm over time. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we give you praise and thanks for your goodness as we contemplate the reform lines, and more than that, Father, as we see history, prophecy being fulfilled at this very moment, as we separate now and we consider the solemnity of this day, what it means to us, especially for those brothers and sisters who are about to be baptized. May this be a glorious day, not only in our own lives, but also in the great controversy. Lord, as we look back upon this time, surely we'll see that prophecy too was being fulfilled at this very event, at this very camp meeting. We ask and pray for a blessing now in Jesus' name. Amen.